Welcome everyone into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, June 10th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about Florida State and Clemson and the ACC, give you guys a little bit of an update there because it's coming up time where Florida State and Clemson are going to have to make a decision, not for this year, but for 2025 if they want to be in the conference. So I want to break that down for you guys and how Florida State is looking in some very interesting directions to possibly get the money they need to get out of the conference. Then we're going to get into Texas. They went a little viral this weekend for a display they put on during the recruiting visit. I want to break down my feelings on this and how I don't necessarily love it, but I suppose the game is the game at this point. Then we'll get into some win totals out of the SEC, a lot of SEC content today. We'll get to some win totals. I'll say who's too high, who's too low, who's absolutely on the money with their prediction this season. And then we'll get into Cinderella Watch for the SEC. I have two teams today. I'm going to go through the conferences throughout the week. But today we're going to do the SEC, and I have two teams that I think could make some more noise than people might be expecting. And then we have a new segment for you all today. We're going to do Monday questions likely throughout from now until the season starts, and kind of just break down different questions that you guys have for the upcoming season. Now, I did 3 myself today, but would love to get some more interaction with the fan base, so absolutely submit any questions you have for that. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. But definitely use that if you would like, gsmcpodcast.net. I can also see comments on the side here, so if you want to just comment something, that's more than fine as well. But let's jump right in and let's talk about Florida State and Clemson, because it's been a little bit quiet around the Florida State-Clemson ACC battle that has been going on for quite some time now, let's be totally honest. It feels like it's been an eternity. It really has only been about 7-8 months, but it felt like it's been much, much longer than that. But Florida State and Clemson are still battling it out with the ACC. I believe there's 5 different lawsuits out there. The 2 initial ones from Florida State and Clemson, ACC countersuing them, and then there's one more from Florida State that was thrown out there to kind of go at the TV deal from ESPN, saying that it wasn't ironclad and they could get out of it because they signed it with the ACC, not with Florida State. So that's kind of an added layer to this. But one of the big things about this that I think is picking up more and more steam as we get further and further into these conversations is, where are these teams going to go? And it seems like the SEC, at least as of right now, does not seem very interested in either of these entities. And I think that might hurt Clemson more than it hurts Florida State, and I'll get into that a little bit later on in the segment. But it does leave a big-time question, right? You're fighting so hard to get out of the ACC, and you want to do it probably as soon as possible. But if you don't necessarily have a landing spot, which is something that some schools in the past haven't had. I think Utah is the best example of this, where they were out of the Pac-12 and they kind of just needed somewhere to go. They weren't going to be one of the teams that was left behind, so they wanted to, hitch their wagon somewhere, and it was the Big 12, and now you can see that's not necessarily where they wanted to be. And they're trying to find their way over to the ACC, which is something that we'll obviously touch on more and more as more stuff comes out from that. But the reality is, this is a very messy situation, and Florida State and Clemson have been pushing for this for quite some time, but the question now becomes, is the grass greener on the other side? And also, can you handle what is coming on the other side? Because there's this very interesting dynamic that has formed around Florida State and Clemson, and it's not to say anything, disparaging towards Florida State and Clemson by any means, but when you talk about where they would stack up in these other conferences in terms of, athletic budget and money and all of that type of thing that seems to be the thing that most people care about in these conversations, Florida State and Clemson currently are number 1 and number 2 in the ACC in terms of athletic budget. Florida State would be 9 in the SEC, Clemson would be 11. So that's a gap. There's no two ways about that. That is going to cause problems for them, not only getting into the league, but once they get there, how they're going to deal with that is going to be a whole nother conversation. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to go into this, and there's a lot of questions from the Florida State and Clemson side of, where do they fit in these conversations with the Big Ten or with the SEC, and how do they kind of make their way out of the ACC, not only just out of it, but into another conference where they're in a better situation? Because there is a reality out there that I think some Florida State and Clemson fans, you likely don't have to worry about it too much, but I do think there is a reality where both these teams find their way out of the conference, and then they find their way into the Big 12. And it makes the Big 12 a little bit better, maybe hurts the ACC a little bit, but you're kind of in the same situation you were a second ago. So that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. I think that both these teams will find a home somewhere. It's just, as of right now, it doesn't seem like too many people are, really chomping at the bit to get these two teams, I guess. And I think the SEC and the Big Ten are the two ones to watch. And Big Ten, I haven't necessarily heard anything definitive from. I think if Florida State would be the team that I would more lean towards the Big Ten, because of some research dollars they have behind their university and some different things that just make them a little bit, would help them a little bit, I suppose, in those Big Ten conversations. Clemson doesn't necessarily have the same thing. And I think that's the team that, frankly, I'm worried about more in these conversations and going forward after they leave the ACC, because I think we all feel that that's going to happen. Now, Florida State is one of the teams that have tried to figure out some of the financial issues that they're kind of dealing with. And it's not necessarily that they're dealing with big-time financial issues over there, but there is, a hierarchy in the sport, and it's becoming more and more clear every single day, and Florida State is currently on the wrong side of that. And there's a couple of different ways they've thought about going about it, but they're the team that has been kicking around private equity probably more than any other major team in college football, at least to my knowledge, that has been reported. I mean, they've been linked to JP Morgan Chase. They've been linked to Sixth Street, Weatherford Capital, which is one of their former players, Drew Weatherford. He was a quarterback for Florida State. He now runs that. So could be a very interesting conversation. CBS apparently reached out to him. I believe it was Dennis Dodd that did this piece, and he declined to comment on the situation. It could mean that they're, fully in talks and trying to figure out what that number is going to look like. It could be that things have cooled off. You never really know. It seems like a lot of people have different ideas of what private equity is going to mean in college football going forward. From where I'm standing, I am finding it to be a thing that's going to be really hard to avoid, I suppose. I think the best way to put it would be everyone's, in this arms race, right? Everyone wants, the best team. They want the most money. They want the best TV deal. They want everything in between. And that's all well and good, but you need money to do that. And from where I'm sitting, at least over the last couple of years, it doesn't seem like anything would hold them back from trying to get that money to compete at the highest level in football. So if that's private equity, it's private equity. And Florida State seems like a team that has really been kicking that around. And there's been a ton of different ideas of what their budget could look like going forward. I believe their AD, Michael Alford, said it would be about 20 different athletic budgets that they've fleshed out for the future up until like 2043. So a lot of programs or a lot of athletic departments around the country are doing this, trying to get their ducks in a row, trying to figure out what the future looks like. And it feels like Florida State is taking maybe the most aggressive approach in terms of, going into private equity, saying we'll take the huge influx of cash, and whatever happens after that is a big time question, because I don't necessarily trust this as much as some other people do. Greg Sankey has said it probably won't be that big of a deal because, as he so eloquently put it, these people want their money back. And that's definitely something that just is the case with private equity. That's what they do. They try to make money for their clients, for their company, and it can create problems when you have a landscape like college football right now that is wide open. And usually when things are wide open and it's kind of like the Wild West, there's a big time chance to make some money. And some people use that to exploit the sport. Some people use it to help the sport. And we'll figure out which is which at some point down the road. But I'd be very worried about private equity getting in on these conversations. I understand that Florida State is trying to bridge the gap, and they're trying to become more of a SEC program, more of a Big Ten program before they even get there. I fully understand the pressures that they're under, but I think they'll find if they do sign these contracts, if they do go through with private equity, in about 5 years, they're going to be maybe regretting that decision because some bills are going to become due from those private equity firms, and it's not necessarily going to be the situation that you want it to be. Now, it does help a little bit that one of the firms is run by a former quarterback of their team. I won't lie to you about that, but it is a very interesting conversation, and I don't know what Florida State and Clemson are looking to do in the future. I don't know where they land in the future. It feels like for both these teams, frankly, the SEC would be the quote-unquote cultural fit. I said before that Florida State fits a little bit more in the Big Ten in some respects with some research dollars and the some different things that they have at their disposal that some SEC teams just don't find quite as important. At least the SEC, when accepting new members, they don't find that quite as important. So we'll see, I guess is the best way to put it. But some decisions do need to be made fairly quickly. I think it's somewhere in August 25th, something like that. They do have to make a decision about where they want to be in 2025. And is it the ACC? Is it somewhere else? And I don't know if they can make that decision if they don't know where they're going to end up. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation. They have the ACC media deal has a look-in clause in February of 2025 that if Florida State and Clemson make it known that they want out of the conference before the 25 season, there's going to be some hard conversations had about possibly renegotiating deal, possibly bringing down the annual amount for that ESPN deal year over year. So it'll be fascinating to watch. Florida State and Clemson are in a really weird spot because it feels like they have a certain amount of power in being on the offensive and being the team that is trying to get out in front of this and trying to get out of their conference and being the powerhouse, college football programs at least that they are. It definitely does help them, but also you're not necessarily the biggest prize in the ACC. As we've gone over before, I think North Carolina and Duke outweigh them by a little bit because of that basketball rivalry, because of that energy, and that's why the SEC looked at trying to get Duke into the SEC as a basketball program. So it'll be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. I think Florida State and Clemson are definitely having some really hard conversations right now. Do we want to pull the trigger on this right now? Do we want to wait until, a little bit down the road and figure out where we are, get our ducks in a row, and maybe have an invitation before we leave? I really don't know what the best way forward is for these two programs, but I know that we'll get some decisions pretty soon about where they're going to be in 2025 and how they're going to kind of go about maybe bridging the gap to get to another conference. So it'll be fascinating to watch. I think Florida State and Clemson have dominated a lot of the conversation over this offseason with these cases and everything. It feels like some of this stuff is starting to come to a head at the very least and starting to get some more answers around what's going to happen. But we'll obviously keep an eye on that. Definitely some more stuff to happen there. And if they're in the ACC in 2025, it's some very, very interesting conversations, that's for sure. But let's move on here. Let's take our first break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Texas. They went a little bit viral this weekend for a interesting recruiting tactic, I'll put it that way, that they employed this weekend for a big-time recruiting visit they had, and I'll get into my thoughts about it. Definitely a lot of people had some thoughts, but I'll give my 2 cents right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows where 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Florida State and Clemson and how some decisions are going to have to be made pretty soon about what they want to do in 2025 with the ACC, and that has a lot of dominoes that could fall with the TV deal, with private equity possibly getting involved with both these universities. So a lot going on, let's just put it that way, but a lot of answers will be coming here pretty shortly, I do think. But let's jump into Texas. They made a little bit of a viral content this upcoming weekend, let's put it that way. They had some big-time recruits on campus, guys like Michael Terry, guys like Javion Hilson, a very, very talented edge rusher that is currently committed to Florida State. They had all of them in town in Austin, and they put on a show, let's put it that way. They had a fleet of Lamborghinis outside their facilities as recruits were walking into their visit. And it started a big conversation on Twitter, as a lot of things around Texas does. They say, Texas is selling the wrong thing to these kids. They're lying to these kids about the way that NIL works at their school. They're doing X, Y, and Z. There's a million different critiques of this, and I have my own. I'll put it that way. But let's jump into this. And overall, let's start with what Texas is selling, because I think a lot of people, when they saw this clip, said, wow, Texas is selling, only NIL, and they're not, leaning into any type of football stuff, and they're selling out and doing X, Y, and Z. And I kind of understand the sentiment there. I understand why this would set off alarms, and frankly, it set off alarms for me. I am a Texas fan. I would proudly admit that. I try my best to keep my biases out of this, and I will for this segment as well. But I think there is that chance where, a kid walking through a fleet of Lamborghinis who you really want on your roster is turned off by that, which is likely the person that you want on your roster anyway, definitely the person that I would want on my team. But there's also run the risk that some kids get involved for the wrong reasons, whether it's NIL or how much they can pay, or getting to drive around one of those Lamborghinis, whatever that looks like. Maybe they commit for the wrong reasons. Maybe they do some things for the wrong reasons, and usually those are the guys that find their way out of your program pretty quickly and could hurt your program in a lot of ways down the road if you're not careful. So there's a lot of things that can happen with this. There's so many different things that can, in a domino effect type of way, affect this program long term. Here's where I kind of pull away from saying that this is exactly what Texas is selling, because frankly, Texas can show off whatever they want. They can have a million bells and whistles. They could have 10,000 Lambos lining DKR for all I care. If the bones of that program are solid, I don't really think there's much of a problem. As long as the messaging within that building is the same as it has been since Sark showed up and will be going forward, I don't think this will be much of an issue. As long as when those kids get into that room, they don't say, if you commit today, you're getting one of those Lamborghinis and you're driving it right out of this place. As long as that's not happening, I don't necessarily see a big issue with this. Now, I don't love it. I'll be totally honest with you. I don't think it's really what college football is about. I don't necessarily think it's really what NIL was designed to do. Maybe some other people have some different thoughts on that, but I think this is showboaty and, just kind of flexing their muscles a little bit. But to be totally fair, Texas has pretty big muscles to flex in the NIL era, and in terms of just having that type of money. So it'd be a little foolish to not flex those muscles. I wish that they were doing it in a little bit different of fashion. I'll be totally honest with you. I found this a little bit, gross. I don't really have a better way to put it. I just found it, not the best way to go about business, I guess is the best way to put it. But overall, it's one of those things that only becomes a problem if Steven Sarkisian and his staff make it a problem. If they let the wrong guys in for the wrong reasons, that's on them. If they, do some of the wrong things that some other programs in their state have done in the past couple of years and throw a lot of money, NIL money, at a recruiting class that might not be intact in a couple of years, you're doing it wrong. And I think they kind of understand that, to be totally honest with you. But let's get to why I don't necessarily think this changes a thing about what Texas is. Now, recruiting is a game at the end of the day. And your job as a football coach, as the recruiting director, as everyone that is involved in these recruiting visits, is to sell a lifestyle. And although that's not necessarily the lifestyle I'd love for them to be selling, if it works, it works. And if those players that walk into that door are walking in, even if they're walking in for the wrong reasons, let's just say they walk in for NIL and that's the only reason. As long as once they get in that building, you whip them up into shape and make them, live up to the standard that you've set over the first couple of years of Steve Sarkisian's reign over there, you're going to be fine. And I understand there's worry around, can you do that with certain guys in that building? But from where I'm standing, Texas hasn't necessarily made much of a misstep since Steve Sarkisian took over. There were not a great situation when he walked in the door. Let's just be totally honest. They had 7 scholarship offensive linemen on the roster. The defensive talent wasn't near where it needed to be for them to compete at a national level. And the turnaround that he's made in those 3 years has just been spectacular. I don't think there's any other way to put it. He had 11 guys drafted for Texas, a program record a year ago, played for the playoff, came up just short to get to a national title, won 12 games for the first time since 2009. So Steve Sarkisian has plenty of things to sell these kids. He's not stopping at the Lamborghinis. It's not just, a NIL check at their door every month and that's the end of the story. It's about so much more than that at Texas, and they're able to sell so much more than that. So Steve Sarkisian can look these recruits in the eye and say, you're going to compete for championships for a really long time, and not be lying, because a lot of things are in place for them to do that. And then he can also look them in the eye and say, if you're going to do that, if we're going to compete for championships, you're going to do it our way when you walk into this building, and they'll follow him because there are results behind it. It's not just, you're not selling a dream at this point. You're selling what's actually happened at Texas. So overall, Texas as a program is about as solid as you can possibly be. Around the country, Georgia is ahead of them. I will say that very comfortably. I think Ohio State in some respects is ahead. I think Bama in some respects is ahead. There's different programs that have different abilities than Texas has. But if we're talking about pure bones of a program, pure foundation of a program, there's very few out there that are as solid as what Texas is right now. Now, do I love that they're adding Lamborghinis in on the conversation on top of that? No. But it can't necessarily hurt. I guess is the best way to put it. It doesn't necessarily do a lot of really, really bad things, at least in the short term for them. All it does is maybe put them a little bit higher on someone's list. And maybe that's the wrong guy. Maybe that's not necessarily the person that's doing it for the right reasons. But as long as once they enter that building, they're doing everything the right way and everything the way that they've been doing it over the first 3 years of Steve Sarkisian's reign there, they're going to be fine. Because let's be totally honest, the first 3 years have been pretty impressive from Steve Sarkisian. They've only improved since he's gotten there, and it's for a lot more reasons than just NIL. So they can show Lamborghinis as much as they want. The proof is in the pudding, and there's plenty of proof for Texas. So I fully understand why people don't like this. I don't like it, frankly. I don't like that this is the way that people go about recruiting. I don't like that 17-year-old kids are inadvertently or, deliberately being sold a lifestyle that probably isn't the best way to go about business. I don't love it. I'm being very, very honest there, and I really won't budge from that opinion. But it doesn't matter what I think. It doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. It matters what Steve Sarkisian and his staff think, and frankly, they've thought a lot of the right things in the first 3 years. Now, is this a minor misstep? Possibly. And they definitely could calibrate and could change up some things. But I will get, in the end here, just quickly, I will get to something that I'm sure a lot of you will love because a lot of you do hate Texas very, very much. The bad scenario for Texas is you let this become who you are. You do this over multiple years where you flaunt Lamborghinis and you flaunt the NIL lifestyle and you lean into that too much and you catch some of the fish that you don't want in your program, and that can cause problems. There's no two ways about that. This does open them up to some some worries that have, gone on in the sport for quite some time, and no one's really immune to those worries really across the country, but Texas putting it out right in front, it definitely does open them up a little bit more. All that being said, and we can say, a million different things about the situation, how much we don't like it, and how it is ruining college football, X, Y, and Z. From a Texas perspective, is this my favorite thing in the world that they did this? No. I don't like it. I think that the people that you actually want in your program would be turned off by that type of thing. I think it's not necessarily the best way to go about business, all of that type of stuff. I don't love it. Do I think it changes anything that Texas is as a program? Absolutely not. There's nothing in this program that changed on Saturday. Now, there could be things that change down the road because of what happened on Saturday, but that risk is very, very little if you fully trust in what Steve Sarkisian and his staff are doing. And from where I'm standing, it's hard to say that you shouldn't believe in it. So as long as there's that intensity, as long as there's still that high standard that they hold their players to, as long as everything in that building is solid, have as many bells and whistles as you want. Run out as many Lamborghinis and G-Wagons and Bugatti. It doesn't matter how many beautiful cars you have out front. As long as you're winning football games and as long as the guys that walk into that building know what the standard is and live up to that standard, you're going to be fine. So I understand why people don't like this. I fully understand why people think it's a dangerous way to go about recruiting, because I think it is, and I don't love it either. But from a Texas perspective, it doesn't change who they are. It changes some perception of them for sure. It changes the way, some people like me or some other media people or some other teams might look at them. But the bones are really solid over there, at least right now. Could cracks form? Yeah. But as of right now, they look really, really solid, and I have no reason to question what Steve Sarkisian is doing over there. So while I don't love the Lamborghinis, while I don't love all the flash and all the NIL lean-in that they're doing over there, the game is the game. And as long as the bones are solid in your program, you're going to be more than fine regardless of what you do. So it'll be fascinating to watch that develop, but let's take our second break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the SEC win totals. There are a couple of teams that I think might be a little too high on these win totals, a couple of teams that I think are frankly way too low on these win totals. So we'll break that down right after this, and so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Texas and their Lamborghini fleet that they had over recruiting weekend. Definitely had some thoughts on that. Don't necessarily love the tactics, but if it works, it works, I suppose is the best way to put it. But let's get into some win totals for the SEC. I have a couple of teams that I think are just too high on this list. I have a couple of teams that I think are too low. So I want to break down that for you guys. But let's first get into what everyone is sitting at for this upcoming year. And it starts obviously up top with Georgia and Texas. These are the teams that are setting the pace in this conference. These are the teams that everyone is looking towards to maybe be in Atlanta at the end of the season, and obviously that game in Austin will have a ton to do with what happens in that conference. But Texas and Georgia are the teams that are setting the pace. I think we can mostly all agree on that. There's some teams that I think have a case to be, had here, I suppose, that they're not as far behind as some people might think from these two teams, but it'll be fascinating to watch these ones. I think this is roughly on the money for these two, just because it's really hard to say that these guys are going to lose more than, 1 or 2 games this upcoming season. Now, that game in Austin might just decide who goes over and who goes under in this one, but it'll be fascinating to watch these two teams. They are definitely setting the pace for this conference. But the 9-5 teams are where a lot happens. You have Alabama, LSU, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Missouri. I think we all agree not all of those teams are going to be 9 or 10 wins this season. I think there's going to be an outlier. There's going to be a team that, underachieves or overachieves, whatever that looks like. So that is too crowded of a group for all of those teams to do right around that. So that's probably where something's really got to give. You have A&M at 8.5 right behind them, the only team at 8.5 right now. So kind of sitting where A&M sat for the past couple of years, right around the 8-4 mark, somewhere in the middle of the conference where they're really sick of being, let's just put it that way. At 7-5, you do have Oklahoma and Auburn, two very interesting teams going into this year. I think both have very tough schedules, particularly Oklahoma, but I think 7.5 is roughly where I would have these teams. Definitely some leeway there for sure. Then you have Kentucky at 6.5, a very weird team that I think a lot of people are just confused about more than anything else, but a very, very interesting number there. South Carolina at 5.5. You have Mississippi State, Arkansas, and Florida at 4.5. So Florida really taking the hit from that from that schedule that they're playing, because it's just ridiculously hard. And then Vanderbilt bringing up the rear at 2.5, which I think we all expected, to be totally honest with you. So there are some obvious ones that I think really stand out in terms of being too high, being too low. There are a couple that are a little bit, I could finagle my way into thinking that they're too high or too low, but I don't necessarily have too aggressive of opinions on some of these. But I do want to get into which ones I do think are too high real quickly. And LSU is the first one. 9.5 is a fantastic number, and I think LSU has a ton of really, really good things on that team. I think the offense is going to be good. The offensive line is the best in the country, if you were to ask me. I think Garrett Nussmeier is one of the most pure passers of the football, and if you just give him protection, he's going to be more than fine. The wide receiver group is really good. There are a number of things to like about this LSU team, but I just keep coming back to the defense. And last year they had a Heisman Trophy winner and two, first-round picks at wide receiver and won 9 games. I don't think they have that this year. I don't think they have the Heisman winner in Garrett Nussmeier. I don't think they have 2 first-round wide receivers, although they have some really good ones over there. I think the offense is going to be good. I don't think it's going to be last year good, and I'm not sure that the defense isn't going to be last year bad. So I'm just a little bit wary of this LSU team. It's a team that I want to like. Every time that I think about them, when I get deeper into the conversation, it just doesn't feel as solid as I want it to. And then Arkansas at 4.5. I hate saying that that's too high for them, but it's just not a great team, to be totally honest with you. Now, Taven Green is going to be a ton of fun to watch. Jaquindon Jackson in that backfield is going to be great. The O-line is not going to be great. It's going to be one of the worst ones in the conference, likely, and that's going to decide a lot of things for them. The defense lost some guys like Chris Paul. Dwight McLaughlin went off to the NFL, so definitely not where they wanted to be on that side of the ball. So it's just a team that you love to sit here and say that Sam Pittman's going to revitalize this program, because, frankly, Sam Pittman's one of my favorite people in the sport and energies in the sport, but it just doesn't look that way. This is not going to be a very good team, and hopefully they can, build from this and continue the way up on Sam Pittman's time there, but it's going to be a rough year for the Razorbacks, if I had to guess. And then the 2 low teams, I want to start with Kentucky at 6.5. I maybe just am seeing something that everyone else isn't, frankly, but when I look at this team, the talent level is right up there among the top of the SEC. At least in terms of the elite players on that team. Deone Walker is one of the best defensive line, one of the best players in the entire country. Maxwell Hairston on the back end of that defense is going to be really, really good this upcoming year. You have guys like Jamon Dumas-Johnson coming in from the portal, De'Eric Jackson in the middle of that defense as well as a linebacker. There's a lot of really good things to like about this team, a lot of returning production. The offensive line is going to be solid. It is kind of Marquise Cox and everyone else, but when you have that left tackle position figured out, it makes things a little bit easier. And then Brock Vandagriff is the key, right? He's the one that I think this is probably why the number is at 6.5 and not a little bit higher, because you don't really know what you're going to get. Last year, you thought that you were going to get really, really good quarterback play from Devin Leary. That's not exactly what happened. Now, he played some good football from time to time, but not necessarily what Kentucky wanted. Now, Brock Vandagriff's ceiling is much higher, but you don't really know what you're going to get out of him. So I kind of understand the number, but from where I'm standing, they're at least an 8-win team. And I think Brock Vandagriff is going to be a really good player, and I think it could get really interesting over there in Lexington. Let's put it that way. But then I want to get into Florida. Florida has an incredibly tough schedule. Frankly, one of the toughest, maybe the toughest schedule I have seen in college football in ever, if I'm being totally honest with you. It is absolutely insane what they have to go through. I do have some questions about their defense. They do definitely have some worries, but I also think that they're better than some people are giving them credit for. I think Graham Mertz is a very good quarterback, frankly, and I think especially behind an offensive line that should be really solid this upcoming year, I think he's going to have a really, really good year. And I don't necessarily know if that equates to a ton of wins because of this schedule that they're going to play, but this is one of those teams that could go 7-5, and I would call them a top 25 team in the country because of the schedule they play, because of what they're going up against. Now, will they go 7-5? I don't know, but I do think they're absolutely capable of doing that. I think there's going to be a lot of games this season for Florida where you look up in the third or fourth quarter where they're playing Georgia or they're playing Texas or they're playing Alabama, whoever it is, and it's a lot closer than you think it's going to be. And maybe they won't win all those games. Maybe they'll lose a lot of one-possession games this upcoming season, but this is going to be a team that's not going to be an easy out. I can say that pretty confidently. They have plenty of stuff going for them where they're not necessarily going to be just this layup of a game that some people might think they're going to be. So I think they're going to find their way at least to 5 wins. I think they're going to get bowl eligible, if I'm being totally honest with you. They're going to steal a game or two that people are not expecting them to, I guess is the best way to put this. And then Vandy at 2.5. This is all about Diego Pavia, if I'm being totally honest. This dude is good for at least a couple of wins that you did not expect. He showed that last year at New Mexico State when they went on the road and beat an Auburn team that was not prepared for that game. Let's just put it that way. They came back the next week and fought Alabama down to the wire. So definitely a very, very interesting last couple of weeks. But Diego Pavia is now at Vanderbilt, and he's going to be playing against Auburn this upcoming year. So definitely not what Tiger fans wanted to see there. But you have a couple of games on the schedule that Vandy could steal. Now, are they going to steal it, or would I bet on them to steal it? Not necessarily, but I think between Auburn, between South Carolina, or maybe even Tennessee at home, there are a couple of games that could just get a little bit sketchy. I'm not saying that I'm not predicting anything. I don't necessarily think they're going to, run the table or do anything crazy against those teams, but I do think there's certain situations that Diego Pavia has an ability to give you a couple of plays here and there that will help you beat those teams. And then it'll be fascinating to watch what this team can do. But I just think 2.5 is just a tad bit disrespectful. I don't think they're going to be a good team, but I think 4 and 8 might be the more accurate number here. But on the money, pretty much everyone else. I think I don't necessarily have aggressive feelings towards any of them. Ole Miss and South Carolina might be a little bit too high. I think Oklahoma might be a touch too low. So there is definitely some things that I looked at a little bit aggressively, but I think most of them are pretty much on the money, and I could absolutely see a lot of these teams being around those numbers. So it'll be fascinating to watch. I'm sure this list will come back to bite me if I'm being totally honest. There's almost no way that it works out this way and all of these predictions come true, but I think it's a really, really fascinating thing to go through this time of season. We'll probably do this throughout the week with the different conferences and give you guys an idea of where I sit with a lot of these teams not too far away from college football season now. So, but let's take our last break here. When we come back, we're going to go back to the SEC, but we're going to talk about some Cinderella teams, some teams that not only could maybe make a run in the SEC, but if they get into the playoff, could absolutely make a run there as well. So I want to break down those teams right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things in the SEC and some win totals to watch. Definitely some very, very interesting things. I think some are a little bit too high, some are a little bit too low, but most of them honestly are pretty much on the money for this upcoming season. But let's get into Cinderella Watch. This is something we'll likely do throughout this week. We'll go through every conference, give you guys an idea of teams that I'm watching that not only could maybe win that conference, but maybe just take the playoff by storm as well. And I have two for the SEC today. And it's a very interesting group of teams because, frankly, they're not necessarily teams that I think usually would find themselves in the dark horse Cinderella type group. But here they are. Let's start with A&M. I think this is a team that a lot of people, when they look at A&M right now, there's a lot of turnover. You know, a new coaching staff coming in with Mike Elko leading the way, a ton of roster turnover with guys like Walter Nolan, Jacoby Matthews finding their way out of the program. And I think a lot of people have just resigned themselves to the thought that A&M's an 8-4 team, A&M's a 9-3 team. They'll finish 3rd or 4th or 5th in the conference, and that'll be that. But I think this team has a gear that I'm not sure that everyone is fully ready for this upcoming season. Now, do I think they're going to light people on fire or do anything absolutely insane? Not necessarily, but I think that guy right there, not Bryce Anderson, but Connor Wegman, the guy right before him, he's the key to this. And I think some people maybe underestimate who he is. I don't know what the going consensus of what this kid can be is, but from where I'm standing, he has every ability to be a top quarterback in this next year's draft. We've talked about how wide open this quarterback class is. We've talked about how there's no one really laying their claim to quarterback one, although I think Carson Beck is pretty comfortably in that position, but that's just a personal opinion. So I think Connor Wegman's a guy that absolutely has a ton to gain from this upcoming year. If he reaches his ceiling, and if this team does incredible things in the SEC, maybe goes to Atlanta, maybe goes to the playoff, who knows, this is a guy that's going to get a lot of talk, and it's because he has every single tool you could possibly want. He can throw the ball all over the field. Now, injuries have gotten in his way in the past, but there's a lot to like about this kid, and I think he's someone that opens them up in a way that they really haven't had in a really long time around A&M. He's, from where I'm standing, the best quarterback they've had in quite some time from a talent perspective. Now, no disrespect to Kellen Mond, I would still put him ahead of him in terms of a talent perspective. So I think there's a lot of things to like about this team. I think there's a lot of things going in the right direction. And I think the biggest thing for me is Mike Elko coming in is super valuable. And I think one of the biggest things that when you're watching A&M over the last couple of years, whether it's the offseason in recruiting or it's on the field in the fall, it feels like there's not a lot of cohesion. There's not identity within that program, at least over the past couple of years. It felt like they were always changing things on the fly. It felt like they didn't have an idea of who they wanted to be and move forward with that steadfast, move forward without any question of that's the way that they want to go. That's not going to be the case under Mike Elko. I can almost promise you that. When that dude comes into a program, the number one thing he brings is identity. He brings toughness. He brings physicality. He brings the things that for so long A&M has needed in that program, and they just haven't had under the past regime. So it's something that I think is invaluable to this team, and I think could open them up to be a very dangerous team this upcoming season. This is one of the seasons in the past, however many, where people aren't coming in saying A&M is a team to really, really worry about. A&M is a team that could win a national title. It feels like a lot of that talk has subsided with some of the past years being the not so great, let's just put it that way, not being the years that they wanted to be by any means. And I think it opens a door for them to play that underdog status that I think is probably where they want to be. So it's one of those teams where you look around and they have a ton of motivation going into this year to buck a lot of the stereotypes that have surrounded A&M and Jimbo Fisher in the past couple of years, and do a lot of the things that they haven't done in the past. And I think they're in a better position to do a lot of that stuff than some people think. On the offensive line, you have a guy like Cam Dewberry, who I think is going to be one of the best guards in the entire country this upcoming year. You have, guys like Shamar Stewart and Nick Scourton on that defensive line. The wide receiver group, I think, is really good. Noah Thomas is one of the most underrated players in the entire country, if you were to ask me. I think he's an NFL-level wide receiver. You also have guys like Moose Muhammad. You have Jade Walker. They're really, really good players in this back end, or in this wide receiver room, that can be difference makers as long as you keep that guy upright. As long as Connor Wegman can sit in that pocket and digest defenses, I think he can do really incredible things. So it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think Mike Elko brings an edge to this team that they absolutely need, an aggression to this team that they need. And I think A&M is a team that you need a certain level of prerequisite talent to get to the national title, to get to the playoff, and they have it. There's no two ways about that. So it'll be fascinating to watch if A&M can finally put it together, and if Mike Elko was really the last missing piece in that entire puzzle. But let's get into the other team here, and it's the Oklahoma Sooners, a team that is kind of funny because it feels like when we're going into this new era of the SEC, all of the talk is around Texas, and it was this weekend with a lot of really weird takes out there following the Lamborghini fiasco that was going on over there this weekend. But Oklahoma is a team that kind of has been overshadowed, and I think some of it is, Texas is just in a better position, has a better roster, a number of different things that go into that, but also it's just kind of the way of the world. When teams come into a league and there's 2 teams coming in, or 4 teams coming in, there's always going to be one that gets more focus than the others. For the Big Ten, it's Oregon. For the Big 12, it's Colorado. So there's always going to be those teams that are pushed to the forefront, and one team or a couple of teams that are kind of in the shadows a little bit. Oklahoma feels like that team, and they have a ton of things in place. The offensive line is an area that I'm a little bit worried about. They brought in Branson Hickman from SMU, which I think is absolutely huge for them. But let's just work under the assumption that the offensive line is going to be at the very least okay this upcoming season. There's not a lot of other places on this team where you can poke a lot of holes. The wide receiver group, to me, is the most intriguing because not a lot of people put them in the Ohio State, Texas, Oregons of the world, but they're not far off. Let's be totally honest. Nick Anderson is, in my opinion, one of the best wide receivers in the entire country. Andrel Anthony adds a dynamic to that offense that is really, really fun to watch and definitely will be a huge part of that team this upcoming season. And then bringing in Deion Burks from Purdue is one of the biggest pickups they've had in this offseason. Definitely someone that has really wowed them through spring and into summer. So this wide receiver group is right up there with one of the best in the country, and Jackson Arnold is the guy that can, take them to the absolute next height, and his ceiling is ridiculously high. This kid could be dropped into an NFL quarterback room and no one would question it because of his size, because of his arm talent, because of all of the things that he brings to a football field. There would not be a lot of questions around him just standing in a NFL quarterback room. Now, he's got to unlock some things this upcoming year. There's no two ways about that. If they want to be the team that, makes a lot of noise in the SEC and possibly gets to the playoff and does some things that people aren't expecting of him, Jackson Arnold is the key. There's no two ways about that. But I think he has elite talent. I don't think there's any two ways about that. Now, the Arizona game did not go the way that he wanted it to by any means, but now he's the guy, and he has been the guy the entire offseason, and it's definitely a huge thing when you're going into the SEC to have someone that is out front. He's going to be the guy that, asserts the dominance, that is the leader, that does a lot of the things that you need him to do. So I think he's in a great position. I think the defensive line is another spot where you worry a little bit, but Dominic Williams was an absolutely huge pickup there. I think Dejon Terry is a great duo with him. So I think as long as they don't have big-time injury trouble there, they should be more than okay. The edge rushing with Ethan Downs and Trace Ford, I think, is going to be more than good. Danny Stutzman in the middle of that defense is one of the best linebackers in the entire country. So there's a lot of things to like about this team. The back end of this defense returns tons of experience, tons of guys that can match up with some of the offensive firepower that they're going to have to go up against. Woody Washington, Billy Bowman are going to have to be huge for this team to do what they want to do this upcoming year. So there's a lot of things going right for Oklahoma. It's been a steady climb since Brent Venables came into the door, and I have full faith that he's going to be able to make it work in the SEC. Now, it could be a little bit of a rough landing. I think that's always in the cards for someone that is struggling on the offensive line and the defensive line the way Oklahoma is, but there's a reality where they coach them up, and a lot of these kids come out and play really, really good football and do some things that, we're not necessarily expecting them to do. So it'll be fascinating to watch. Both those teams, I think, have a chance to really shock the world and make sure it's known that they're not just, in the SEC to collect a paycheck and hang out, and Oklahoma especially is not here to be second fiddle to Texas by any means. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. The SEC is a very interesting conference, and frankly, there were a couple other teams like Kentucky and Auburn that I absolutely could have dropped in here, but I feel like OU and Texas A&M have just a little bit more of that talent level that I'm looking for when I'm, looking for that possible Cinderella team. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. We will definitely get to the Big Ten tomorrow with some very, very interesting teams out there, but for now, we'll take our final break, and when we come back, we have a little bit of a new segment for y'all. We're going to do Monday questions. This is likely something we'll do pretty much every Monday, but we'll break down everything for it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the Cinderella teams from the SEC. I got into Texas A&M and Oklahoma this time around. We'll definitely revisit some other conferences throughout the week and give you guys an idea of who I think could steal the show out there as well. But let's get into a new segment called Monday Questions. I figure we're getting a little bit closer to the college football season, and I feel like it's time to really start answering some questions, start to get down to brass tacks here, and I want this to be kind of an interactive segment. So you guys, leave a question that you have for future segments that we'll do on this and give you guys an idea of what I'm talking about with this upcoming segment. I did 3 questions of my own today, but I want to do 3 every Monday, whether it's, a prediction that you have that you want me to react to, or a question that you have about the upcoming season, about a specific team, about a specific player. Anything is on the table for this. So I definitely want to hear from you guys and definitely incorporate some of the questions going forward. But let's get into what I have for today, and I think there's a lot that goes into this. There's a lot of different questions that we can ask for this one, but I wanted to start with a kind of a broad one, and I'll give you a broad one, kind of medium broad, and then a very specific one, so just to give you guys an idea of what the questions could be. And for this one, what is the most important thing for the future of this sport? There are tons of things that I would argue are wrong about this sport right now that need to be figured out in the future and need to be figured out as quickly as possible. And I think that is anything from NIL to a payment structure going forward to transfer portal to whatever, what have you. It doesn't necessarily matter. There's a number of things that very much need to be figured out going forward in this game. To me, there's nothing more important in the future of this sport than leadership. I think right now we are looking at college football with a governing body that doesn't really yield a lot of power. Now they stand over the sport. They definitely are the quote-unquote governing body, but when you don't have a lot of enforceable rules, when you don't necessarily have the same power that some of the conference commissioners have in some of these rooms that you need to have power in, it's not necessarily where you want it to be, right? The NCAA is not necessarily doing the things that you want to do. You want seen done from a leadership perspective in college football, and they haven't necessarily been doing that for quite some time. And I think college football in particular, they need a voice, whether it's one person, whether it's an entity, what have you. I don't frankly care, if I'm being totally honest with you. I care who the person is, obviously, but I don't care what form this takes. I want this to be a thing. I want a voice. I want, a clear way forward and order across the board for teams in the Big 12, teams in the ACC, teams in the SEC, the Big 10. I want them to be operating the same way. This sport feels like for the past, 5 years, it's been moving at very different paces. The SEC and Big 10 have been moving at one pace, the ACC and the Big 12 another. And it's caused a lot of problems. Now, what does the future look like in leadership in this? I don't really know. I think there's a lot of questions of how this is going to look going forward. Now, is it the NCAA keeping their power structure right there and, maybe making a little bit more waves, maybe doing a little bit better job going forward? Is it Greg Sankey? Is it one of those guys that steps up to the plate? Is it Tony Petitti that absolutely could be in on these conversations? So there are a million different ways that this thing can go, but there's no question about it. When we look at the future of the sport and there's a million different questions, the only way you answer those is with someone or sub-entity in front taking it and, actually caring about the sport and actually doing the right things about the sport. So you can't do any of this stuff without leadership. You can't do any of this stuff without a good structure in place. And until we have that, we're in kind of limbo in college football right now. But let's move on to Ole Miss and let's talk about, can they live up to the hype? I don't know if there's anyone going into this year that has quite as much hype to do something that they've never done before than Ole Miss. They have an incredible transfer portal class, a third-year starter. Lane Kiffin is coaching probably the best football he has in his career, and it lines up really well, right? They're ready to kick the door down. Now, will they? I'm not exactly sure. There's a really, really good roster and on their hands. I mean, the defense in particular, they did a great job on that in the transfer portal. I mean, bringing in guys like Walter Nolan, Princio Manmiel, and Chris Hardy on the front line is going to be absolutely incredible. Then you have Brandon Turnage, Trey Amos, Isaiah Hamilton on the back end. So they did plenty of work on that defensive side of the ball to make sure this isn't a problem. The one area that I am a little bit skeptical of is the O-line, because I think it's not necessarily quite as solid as you'd like it to be. They did bring in some great transfers, a couple from Washington that absolutely will help them out, but I don't know if it's necessarily where they want it to be as of right now. The wide receiver group is going to be absolutely incredible. Trey Harris, Juice Wells, Jordan Watkins is about as good as it gets. And then you add Caden Prescore into the conversation, and it gets really, really interesting. So I think Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss are in a great position. They can do pretty much anything they want to do this upcoming season. They can win the SEC. They can go undefeated. They can, win the playoff. They can have a remarkable season. Now, you're walking a little bit of a tightrope with the transfer portal class that they brought in, a lot of the guys that have to hit, hitting the way that you want them to. But at the end of the day, this is a team that has essentially everything in place. I am a little skeptical buying Ole Miss stock right now, I'll be totally honest with you. But I do think when you look at this team and you ask, can they live up to the hype? There's no reason they can't. That's for sure. There's a ton of things that tell me that this team is ready for that next step. And until we get on the football field, it'll be really hard to tell if they're able to really kick the door down or not. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. But let's finish it off with Drew Aller. And let's talk about, is he ready to take that next step? Will he take a big leap going into this next season? And in my opinion, he might be the biggest or one of the biggest dominoes in the entire sport from a player perspective. When you talk about if this kid can reach a ceiling, Penn State is a team that could turn the Big Ten on its head. It could be Penn State at the very top. It could be everyone else fighting for second, frankly. I think that's how talented this kid is. I think that's what his ceiling is. Now, last year didn't necessarily give you too many reasons to be overly bullish about his ability to pull off that big time leap, but at the end of the day, the tools are incredible. He kind of reminds me of Jackson Arnold in the sense that he is NFL build and he has NFL arm talent. Now, does he have NFL decision making? Not so much, but that's definitely something that he'll try to develop throughout the season. One of the biggest questions for Drew Aller going into this season is who's he going to throw the football to. Now, Julian Fleming, I feel like, is a relatively known commodity. Now, I don't necessarily know if it's a wide receiver commodity, or wide receiver one commodity, excuse me, but a good player nonetheless. Definitely someone that will help their offense. Caden Saunders, as I talked about last week, I think he's the key that really opens up this offense to be not just good, but elite. I think Harrison Wallace absolutely has a chance to break out. Tyler Warren will be kind of that security blanket at tight end. So there are some things to like. It's not necessarily the group that Penn State wants. It's actually definitely not the group that Penn State wants. But the reality is there's a lot of good things there. And then Andy Kotelnicki is really the key here. If he can unlock this kid and put this kid in winning positions, he's going to be successful. The question is, how successful can they win the Big Ten? Can they go to the playoff and maybe compete for a national title? It all rides on that kid's shoulders, and that's a lot of pressure. There's a lot going into the season for Drew Aller, but at the end of the day, from where I'm standing, I would lean more that he takes a big step forward than he stands right still. Now, I don't necessarily know if he's going to be able to reach the lofty goals that he absolutely has for himself, but I do think that he will take a step forward. I do think that he'll be a much more consistent week-to-week quarterback than he was a year ago, and Penn State has a lot of stuff in place to where as long as that one thing happens, a lot of other things can happen right after it that will be very, very good for Penn State football. So again, to finish this out here, I would love to have some of y'all's questions on here. Definitely don't necessarily want to be speaking to myself every time around here. So would love to be, pulling a couple of questions from the comment section or from wherever going forward for this segment. So definitely leave any comments you have, any questions, any predictions, anything really, and I'll find a way to kind of put a spin on it and have some fun on Fridays at the end of the show. So definitely will be a really, really good time trying to make this show just a little bit more interactive between me and you guys. So definitely will be a really good time for all of us. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for every single content update you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing incredible work across every single sport. So whatever you need in the world of sports, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Let's go.